So.
Yeah, no? Welcome to the second session of Professor Bad Trip's Symposium. I'm sorry, I'm a bit. I had some problems with the computers there, so I'm trying to calm down now. I'm very happy that my dear colleague Oliver Korte is now going to present his talk on flowing down to slow. He called it Trapped Viscosity and Solidification in Romitelli's Flowing Down to Slow. Oliver Korte is a composer, he is a music theoretician, he is a musicologist, and also vice president of this institution here where we do the Congress. He very quickly became interested in the analysis of contemporary music, but he also works in a couple of different fields, going down to Renaissance music reconstruction and romantic music. Today, of course, we are interested in the modern field and in the Romitelli analysis he has done in Flowing Down to Slow. So, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Sascha. He helped me a lot with the computer. My computer didn't work as it should. And now I'm using his, so if anything goes wrong, it's his fault.
My fault.
Yeah, you know.
Always.
You can analyze Fausto Romitelli's music, but that's not what he aims at. You can discuss his aesthetics, but that's not his target. You can also lean back and just enjoy his music, but that is certainly not his goal. What Romitelli really wants to achieve, particularly in his famous later works, is that you lose yourself. And make no mistake, to accomplish this, he doesn't hesitate to make use of psychological tricks and even a bit of force. In the program note for the ensemble piece Flowing Down to Slow of 2001, he points out its hypnotic and ritualistic aspect. And his last work, the video opera An Index of Metals, he describes as an initiation rite, working with the means of hypnosis, obsession, and trance. He wants to involve you in a musical ritual, in the course of which you may, at least in part, lose your free will. And don't say that Romitelli didn't warn you. He repeatedly points out the risks and clarifies that his musical journeys tend to turn into horror trips. Romitelli's musical rites have nothing to do with religion. They are social, modern, or postmodern, I may add, let's see later. They are postmodern or modern, media-related, dystopian, and they are always secular. Anthropologists Sally F. Moore and Barbara Meyerhoff discuss some essential characteristics of such secular rituals in general. I quote, "Collective ceremony gives form to that which it contains. Ritual is part of a form, and a form which gives certain meanings to its contents. The work of ritual, then, is partly attributable to its morphological characteristics. Its medium is part of its message. It can contain almost everything. For any part of social life, any aspect of behavior or ideology may lend itself to ritualization. And once used in a collective ceremony, whether performed for the first time or for the 1000th, The circumstance of having been put in the ritual form and mode has a tradition-like effect. Even if it is performed once, for the first and only time, its stylistic rigidities, its internal repetitions of form or contents make it tradition-like. Interestingly, Moore and Meyerhoff emphasize the form rather than the content as a central identifying feature of a ritual. According to them, the form of a ritual has a tradition-like effect, even if there is actually no historic tradition standing behind it. They especially point out the essential role of internal repetitions. I want to add that repetitions enhance the value of the repeated objects and create stability, insofar as they allow the participants to recognize and to anticipate these objects. But they also demand submission under the given form. And this last aspect leads us to an important psychological effect of repetition. It is a most effective trigger for altering one's state of consciousness, for falling into trance. In Romitelli's music, repetition is the structural link between ritual and trance. In fact, Romitelli seems quite often not to be primarily interested in the contents of a ritual, but in its structure. For example, there could hardly be two things more different than the mantras of the Tibetan Book of Dead and the flashiness of low-quality TV entertainment. But Romitelli uses them both, the former in the ensemble works En Trance and Lost, and the latter in the e-guitar piece Trash TV Trance. He uses both materials for the same purpose, to explore the structure of rituality with special respect to inducing trance. If someone aims at the completion of a certain task in the future, his or her time perception will be linear and directional. By contrast, if one repeats certain actions without a goal, time perception will be different, more circular, because attention is drawn to the present time rather than the future or the past. This orientation towards the present is why philosopher Søren Kierkegaard regarded repetition as the only source of happiness, because one suffers neither of the melancholy of memory nor of the restlessness of hope. But less positively, it was Sigmund Freud who observed, any activities, whatever, may become obsessive actions in the wider sense of the term if they are elaborated by small additions and given a rhythmic character by means of pauses and repetitions. We shall not expect to find a sharp distinction between ceremonials and obsessive actions. Romitelli, for his part, points out more than once that obsession plays a major role in his music. He walks on the thin line between voluntary and compulsive actions, and by trying to musically induce hypnotic, trance-like states, he definitely wants his audience to delegate a part of their will to the composer. A repetitional form causes a formal problem because there are no objective criteria to define the number of repetitions within a ritual. Social anthropologists Carolyn Humphrey and James Laidlaw state, ritualization changes the relationship between action and time. The fragmentation of continuous action into separate, labeled actions is the precondition for the organization of sequences and structures. Since ritualization transforms action into mimesis, it has no natural relationship to time and number. A ritual can be multiplied, reversed, hierarchized, or protracted for days, because nothing has to follow from this kind of action. Thus, the number of repetitions of an action within a ritual is a matter of invented order and not of practical purpose. A ritual has no concrete external functions. All actions are merely symbolic, or as Humphrey Laidlaw put it, mimetic. From it follows that it has no practical given form, but it requires one, so a form has to be invented. A Catholic rosary, for example, consists of exactly 59 beads, and the sequence of small and large ones is strictly fixed. For every mystery of the rosary, you have to pray exactly 10 Hail Mary, anteceded by a Lord's Prayer and concluded by a Glory be. From an external point of view, there's no necessity to all of this. But from the inside, the specific sequence and count is an essential part of the ritual. Fausto Romitelli creates the form of flowing down to slow quite comparable to a rosary. He strings together sets of repetitions, and in doing so, he follows rules that he especially invented for this purpose. Here you see 6 sections, A to F. Every single one consists of a set of repetitions of a basic sound object, a sound mantra, if you will. And these are the rules. All numbers of iterations are multiples of 3, and half of the sections contain exactly 12 iterations of the sound object. And all numbers of bars are multiplies of 5, and half of the sections count 30 bars. For clarification, the alternative bar counts in sections E and F depend on which musical parameter you regard as the most important. To create large form, Romitelli just puts these 6 sections in sequence. With one exception, he splits section C right in the middle of the 4th iteration to insert section D in between. Obviously, the overall structure of flowing down is highly rational and not at all accidental. Romitelli's first step was most probable to draft the temporal structure, and it is what was only subsequently that he filled the proportional structure with actual music. But now, a most subversive moment, which we have repeatedly talked about in this conference, comes into play. Romitelli superimposes gradual processes that prove the pretended stability of the repetitional structure as to be deceptive. These processes might begin quite discreetly, but often enough they become maximally violent and catastrophic. It is with these processes that linear directional perception of time sneaks back in, and it might be too late before you even realize it. Now I want to discuss some of these superimposed processes in flowing down to slow. As a first step, I have to take a look at the placement of the instruments on stage, because they are positioned with respect to their musical function. A double bass plus metal percussion sit in the center. They are flanked by 2 groups, each consisting of a string quartet and a synthesizer. Romitelli describes the musical functions as follows. The group placed in the center presents a sound object which the opposed symmetrical ensembles read, analyze, progressively distort, and mix with new objects. Romitelli states that the piece is all about sound objects. presented by the center group. But now, how can we understand the remark that the flanking groups read and analyze these objects? Every instrument just plays its own part and does not at all analyze the parts of the others. In fact, Romitelli describes an idea inherent to the process of composition itself, rather than the activity of the musicians. This is to compositionally simulate the operation mode of live electronics. The function of signal processing that would be executed automatically by electronic devices is delegated to the composer who implements it into his score. On a very informative sketch, and we have seen a very similar sketch just before for Professor Badtrip, and there could be many pieces where this sketch is found again, a basic sketch for all of his work. In a very informative sketch, Romitelli listed some practical possibilities of realization. He differentiates between effetti mono and effetti stereo. And under effetti mono, we find a long list of live electronic effects. Riverbero, modulazione del riverbero as an addition, flanger, harmonizer, echo, delay with the addition avere acustica artificiale, compressore, espansore, distorsore, chorus, FM, wah-wah, vibrato, filter, and finally shifting. Behind every headword, we see a little drawing on how to transfer the respective effect onto analog instruments. Only two examples for this. Reverb. A short, accentuated event represents the input signal. The output signal is notated underneath. It is a prolongation of the input signal, but with a reduced sonic richness insofar as it has to be played sordino or tasto or ponticello. Second, echo delay. Again, the input signal is a short event with an accent, but here the output signal consists of equally spaced and gradually shrinking events. Romitelli specifies these effects with the words avere acustica artificiale. His idea is that the flanking ensembles envelop the center group in different simulated room acoustics. The Fondazione Giorgiottini in Venice holds Romitelli's original typoscript for the program note of Flowing Down. It shows that he originally planned to call the work Scanner, and he himself explains in the text that he adopted working techniques of electronic artists like Robin Rambaud, aka Scanner. But I suggest that the connection goes a bit deeper. The relation of the instrumental groups on stage can be compared to the operation mode of a technical device. A scanner reads, processes, and sends data or signals. As fitting as this early idea of a title might be, it is still fairly one-dimensional. This might be the reason why Romitelli eventually replaced it, and to my opinion, rightfully so, with the original title. I will come back to this later. Now, I want to examine the specific sound object that the double bass and percussion present in section A. It consists of two subordinate objects. Firstly, a minor third, G B flat, which will be perceived as an incomplete G minor chord. And secondly, an E minor chord tilting slightly towards E major as the double bass blends in an E spectrum. I will repeat this. Okay, first time we heard the second chord, now we heard the first one, everything is complete. Section A consists, as mentioned before, of 12 iterations of the sound object. On a fundamental sketch, the one I have shown before, Romitelli characterizes this movement as pendolo or movimento pendolare. The back and forth of the two sonorities literally resembles the iconic pendulum to be found in the basic equipment of a hypnotist. Let us hear section A, played by Musique Nouvelle and directed by Jean-Paul Dessy. Now for the superimposed processes. First, the durations. To fully understand Romitelli's approach, it is helpful to examine the two subordinate sonic objects separately. The first entrance of the incomplete G minor chord has a duration of 3/4. It increases with the following iterations, reaches a maximum of 6/4 in the fifth iteration to decrease again towards the end. The whole development resembles a shape of an arc. With the E minor chord, it's just the other way around. It starts with 6/4 to decrease down to 3 and subsequently increase again. The resulting shape is complementary to the first one. The two developments balance each other out, but, and this is very important, not perfectly. The sums of pairs oscillate between 9 and 10/4. The structure as a whole is repetitive, but at the same time elastic. The breathing durational development is balanced, but the entrance of every single sonority remains slightly unpredictable. Secondly, the pitches. In his above-mentioned program note, Romitelli writes that the flanking ensembles progressively distort the sound object presented in the center group. Let us see what this means for the 12 iterations of the incomplete G minor sonority. At the first appearance, both string quartets exactly double and by that amplify the pitches G and B flat of the center group. But with the second iteration, the process of distortion starts. All pitches of quartet 1 gradually ascend by quarter tones, while the pitches, I do it a bit faster, while the pitches of number 2, string quartet number 2, descend. And this is exactly what a ring modulator would do, by the way. So we have the simulation, the analog simulation of a electronical device. Towards the end of the section, there appear some larger steps, and this is because Romitelli aims at particular pitches. And here you see the pitches. It is the natural spectrum over E flat. And note that the seventh partial, the natural minor seventh D flat, is represented by both its possible quarter tone approximations, one a bit too low and the other slightly too high. Here, at the end of section A, we have one of the few moments where the direction of the signal processing is inverted. Here, it is the double bass that reads the signal of the string quartets. The input signal is the partials 3 to 8 of the E-flat spectrum. The double bass does not, as before, change back to the low E, but reacts to the quartets by underlying the fitting fundamental pitch E-flat. Stability is reinstated, albeit on a new pitch, and with this ends section A. Romitelli meticulously plans every detail of his rituals. He is the master of ceremony, hypnotizing his audience, but himself acting in cold blood. That is why he states in an interview, freely referring to the philosopher Émile Cioran, the artist is like an assassin who doesn't kill his victim just like that, but slowly organizes every detail of his murder. And I'm very thankful to Jakob that he presented the original quote by Cioran yesterday. Let me return to the title. According to Alessandro Arbo, the final title, Flowing Down to Slow, is a quote from the Pink Floyd song Ibiza Bar on the album More of 1969. This song is about the feeling of being trapped in a life determined by others, unfree as a character in a movie script. Now, this has a certain self-referentiality to it because More actually is a soundtrack for Barbet Schroeder's movie by the same title. It tells the story of a young German from Lübeck, by the way, who drops out of his ordinary middle-class life to become a hippie. After an episode in Paris, he lives on the island of Ibiza, where, together with his American girlfriend, he slips into drug addiction. And of course, the story has a tragic ending. You will agree that this background makes for a perfect Romitelli title. The only problem is that the line flowing down to slow does not appear in the song Ibiza Bar. It is a phantom, a typical mishearing. It is a fragment of an extremely corrupted version which still can easily be found on the internet. The question is whether Romitelli was aware of that. And I'm tempted to assume that he was, that he chose the title Flowing Down to Slow not despite, but because it is a false Pink Floyd line. The program note for the orchestra piece Audiodrome states, much of what we see or hear is not simply reproduced, but processed and reshaped by an electronic medium that redefines the nature of the message, superimposes the real facts, and ultimately replaces them. And by the way, I may add that this is exactly what happened to my sound example just before. It is true that if it is true that medium is the message, then the basic information of the message is less important than the one of the transporting channel. The technology that makes the transmission, electronic processing and distortion of the message possible becomes the actual object of communication. In the case of the work title, Flowing Down to Slow, the medium might also be a significant part of the message. A reference to the mode of operation of electronic media, its continuous process of filtering, distorting and corrupting facts, and bringing forth new, alternative facts. And might be politically very important at recent times. Now I will come to the examination of the end of the game, the crucial final section of the piece. The basic sonic object consists of three subordinate objects, the three major thirds GB, G flat, B flat, and A, C sharp. The double bass lays an E, a low E, underneath the first interval, creating an E minor chord identical to that from the beginning of the piece. Second try. In fact, E serves as the clear tonal center of the entire piece. E minor plays a pivotal role in every section of the piece. This can certainly be understood as a reference to one of Romitelli's teachers, Gérard Griset, and his monumental Espace Acoustique, which is entirely based on the E spectrum. But on the other hand, both composers and many others chose E for practical reasons because it's the lowest pitch of the double bass. Section F consists, like section A, of 12 iterations of the basic sonic object. The E minor chord appears identically all 12 times. But the other two subordinate objects that you see here on the sheet are subjected to superimposed processes. The intervals in the percussion do not change, but the strings envelop them in changing spectra. And this is the idea. With every iteration appear progressively stretched spectra. The degree of stretching results from the condition that every spectrum must contain the respective pitches of the percussion. You see these on the left of the sheet, these two pitches, these major thirds. So the two major thirds of the percussion serve as a constant axis. The more the spectra are stretched, the more remote are the partials they present. For example, in the case of the first spectrum of the upper stave, the pitches F sharp and A sharp represent the fourth and fifth partial, but in the last spectrum of the stave, they represent partials 8 and 9. Before analyzing how the other musical parameters support and emphasize this process of stretching, let us hear the complete section. It lasts about 3.5 minutes, and I hope that the transmission is okay, will be okay. Der ist noch nicht an. Ne? Musst du jetzt erst hochfahren?
Ich habe das Gefühl, dass der geschlossen ist.
Ah. Ist noch drin, ist alles noch drin.
Ist eigentlich 81%.
Vielleicht ist es einfach die Zeit gewesen. Naja.
Vielleicht mag der dieses Programm nicht, ich weiß nicht.
Und was hast du jetzt gemacht? Einen anderen Sound?
Ja, wir probieren
Vorsicht,
das jetzt
dann
mit
den
dem
Kaffee.
Adapter.
Dann muss ich den aber kurz auswählen hier wahrscheinlich. USB Codec.
Okay. Okay. This is the crux with a hybrid version of a Congress. We do our very best. Okay, let's have a look whether the sound example sounds better now. For the durations, the durations of the first subordinate object, the unchangeable E minor chord, fluctuate around 2.5 quarters, but but show no general direction. The step size is always 0.5, with one exception. Both steps to and from iteration number 6 are too large, 1.5. And also the duration is longer than all the others. I suspect that this is a mistake of Romitelli's, who planned a duration of 2.5 instead of 3.5. The durations of subordinate object number 2 undergo a process of stretching parallel to the spectra. They increase perfectly. Was? Tja, okay, I'll try to.
Also hier unten kommt es nicht an bei dem Rechner. Du hast oben das andere Bild.
I want to quote Gaia von Sichowski, "Truth, a horror trip." After this presentation, we know everything we have to know about electronic media and what it does to information. Okay, here it is not the right sheet, but on YouTube it is. Now we start to see YouTube here, but it has a delay, I think. That's not a good idea.
No, that's completely not a good idea to go into the network with this whole stuff connected.
No. Okay. What can I do? I just can tell you that the subordinate objects too, the duration of both increases very much. One a bit less, one a bit more. So, summed up, we find, and you heard it before, we find a significance increase of duration. The whole section is a large composed out retardando. And the dynamics supports this process. The expended energy increases from piano to triple forte, initially in groups of 3, and later increasingly towards the end. So what happens here at the end of the piece? In his program note, Romitelli speaks of a, quote, loop destined to a catastrophical drift. The catastrophe happens here in section F. The repetitive structure, which Alessandro Arbo describes as a hypnotic ostinato constrained in a depressing circularity, becomes over-expanded, reaches a point where no further step is possible. The movement stops on the verge of returning to the E minor sonority. It doesn't reach the point of stability anymore, but simply comes to a halt. The string instruments spend a last excessive amount of energy, the bow pressure becomes too high, the pitches turn into noise, and then the bows literally freeze on the strings. And here the viscous musical stream, already flowing down too slow, solidifies, and the mosquito, will remain petrified for millions of years to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, we are very sorry for the problems that we just had. Maybe we can use the discussion later on to see a few of the slides that we didn't manage to project. Yes. I also noticed that a few were on the internet that we didn't see in the room, so it was a very confusing situation.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but thank you very much for the talk. I would suggest that now we continue and we discuss later because of time progression.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, our next speaker is also from Lübeck, but he is a real specialist when it comes to hearing. He, for example, developed hearing aids. He is teaching psychoacoustics at the University of Science in Lübeck. And I thought it would be a nice idea to get an impression on the effects of drugs on hearing from a real specialist, as this is something we are dealing a lot when we talk about Romitelli's music. So I'm very happy that when I make space there, we can have this talk by Jürgen Tchorz from the University of Applied Sciences, and his theme is When Sounds Dress Up in Colors, Music Perception and Drugs. Das kann ich hier nicht sehen. Aber
brauche ich eine Internetverbindung oder einfach nur den, also WLAN brauche ich nicht, ne? Nur den Netzwerkstecker, der ist drin.
Ich habe das einmal eingestellt, aber richtig eingestellt. Das steht drin, habe ich schon gesehen.
Er sagt auch, dass er 2 Verbindungen hat.
Hey.
Ja.
Hast du Klangbeispiele, dass du das... Nee, okay. So, juhu, we have our projection and our next speaker, Jürgen Tchorz. I'm very happy that you are here and telling us something about perception changes under drugs for our auditory system. He is coming from the University of Applied Sciences, worked on hearing aids, and so I'm very curious because I'm not a specialist at all, but I'm trying to understand what Romitelli wanted to express in his music.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'd like to introduce some temporal distortions, so to get the time right. And I'd like to start in Paris, late 19th century, mid 19th century, where a couple of writers and other artists met from time to time in a hotel there to explore the effects of taking cannabis. And to describe their experience with that. And Charles Baudelaire wrote something which is one of the first descriptions of the interplay between taking cannabis and auditory impressions. He said, "The ear perceives almost inaudible sounds amidst great turmoil. This is where hallucinations start. External objects start to assume a strange look. Then the ambiguities follow, the misunderstandings and alterations of ideas. Sounds dress up in colors, and colors contain music." So this would be a description of what we would call like synesthesia today. And as I said, one of the first descriptions of what drugs, in this example, cannabis does to our ears. In general, and on one slide, so what happens to us when we take drugs? So this, of course, depends on the type of drugs. So there are many different drugs, we'll come to that a bit later. Depends on your experience, also your habituation, and also on the expectation you have that these drugs will do to you. And these effects can include like relaxation or excitement or even mystical experience, but also horror and bad trips. And when you take drugs, then certain brain regions are activated, which are involved in reward, in emotion, in motivation and arousal. And these are similar brain regions which are also activated when you listen to music or when you have good food or sex. And also there are reactions of the autonomic nervous system, for example, pupil dilatations, or the heartbeat increases, or the skin resistance decreases because the skin gets a bit more moisture. And when you look at music now, what does music do to us and what happens to us when we hear music, we see it's quite similar actually. It depends not on the type of drugs, but on the type of music and on your personal preference, and it can give you like chills or joy, sadness, excitement, and shivers down the spine, strong reactions, and can turn to or can lead to body movements from like subtle tipping your toes until the whole range, until complete excitement, complete freak out. And well, yes, there is activity involved in certain brain regions which are connected to reward, motivation, and emotion, as with drugs, food, and sex. And the same with the autonomous system. You see pupil dilatations, heartbeat increases and skin resistance changes. So quite similar what we see with drugs. So this is one example what music does to us when it comes to the autonomic nervous system. Now here the heartbeat. So this is part of a study 2003. There were several subjects, and each subject was asked, well, which piece of music really touches you? So where do you have like chills and shivers going down the spine, and which is it for you, for this individual? And what can be seen here is they had one individual. I hope you can see, yes, you can see the pointer. So there's one individual, and the piece of music he or she said it gives him or her chills was a Rachmaninoff piece. And you see the time, it's 90 seconds, the duration, and here is the heartbeat in beats per minute. And you see in a certain area of that music piece, the heartbeat goes up and the person feels these chills. And this is highly reproducible. So you can do this 10 times and you measure 10 times the same. When you play another piece of music to this person, you see on the right, nothing happens. Nothing happens. But this piece was a piece another subject was indicating this is a piece that gives me some chills. So it's a really very, it's an experience which is quite personal. And so music, pleasure with music strongly depends on your preference that you have. So we see that music has the power like to make one high. So individuals who love a certain type of music, they can transport it to what people call an altered state of consciousness. It depends on the music and it depends on the listener how this altered state looks like. It could be something like contemplation, so something like a spiritual experience. Maybe this fits to the picture we see here. It's called l'ecstasy. So it's some kind of inward experience that you feel. Or it can go into the other direction, like excitement and rhythm of some rave party can really trigger dancing ecstasy. So not very introverted, but the other way around. So very strong emotions, very strong reactions are triggered by music, which is normally not what you see when you like read a poem or watch a painting or something. So these reactions to music seem to be stronger. And this is something like a mysterion. Why has music such a big effect? Charles Darwin, he was wondering why, like music, this is sound, this is fluctuations of air pressure. So why can it have such a great impact? And he said, well, as neither the enjoyment nor the capacity of producing musical notes are faculties of the least use to man in reference to his daily habits of life, they must be ranked amongst the most mysterious which he's endowed. So he really could not understand how listening to music helps us to survive and has any impact on the evolution of mankind. So he was puzzled by that. When we look at animals, and Darwin did, we don't see anything like that. So primates, for example, non-human primates, they show little enjoyment or preference or whatever for music. So studies have been done with tamarins, you see on the picture, and when they have the choice between music stimuli and silence, they prefer silence. So maybe they didn't find the right music, I don't know.
Sort of the same thing happens like.
Oh, okay. The cable, thank you. So there are no real explanations for that. One try to explain that is that music is some kind of communication. When we communicate, when we talk to someone, we are empathic. So when someone tells us a sad story, we feel sorrow as well. And if someone is in a good mood and tells us some stories, and we feel the same. So it's a kind of communication. Also music. I mean, music can transport sadness and joy and other things. So one explanation would be that we can describe music as a form of communication which is mostly nonverbal. So I was explaining in short like effects of music and the effects of drugs and the combination, the link between music and drugs is a very old one. When we look at the Romans, for example, they were known to have, well, great parties, and drugs played a role beside music. Music was important there, but drugs as well. We know that they had lots of alcohol, but also magic mushrooms and belladonna. Belladonna is a drug which increases pupil size and makes also hallucinations, but you have to be really careful about the doses, can be deadly. And when we jump now to the last century, many music genres are closely connected and related to drugs. Jazz, for example, if you look at John Coltrane or Charlie Parker, for example, had massive like problems with drugs. Charlie Parker died in his 30s, and John Coltrane also, I think, when he was 40. Thelonious Monk and others took lots of drugs, and taking those drugs, that was closely connected to the way they played the music. If you think of reggae music, it's hard to think reggae without cannabis, I would say. That's very obvious, but also later, like in the 60s, it started West Coast music, rock music. You see here Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? And many people think that experienced refers to being experienced to taking drugs. And you also see a picture of Pink Floyd. In the middle there's Syd Barrett, who was a co-founder of Pink Floyd and one of the creative heads of that band. But well, he had excessive use of drugs and developed also mental problems, so that he couldn't be part of the band anymore. So he left in the late 60s. But he's the Crazy Diamond, so that song was dedicated to him a couple of years later. Another example we see here, that's a band not so famous. This is Spaceman 3. This is a psychedelic rock band of the 80s and early 90s. And I included them here because they had an album with a really remarkable title. It was called Taking Drugs to Make Music to Take Drugs To, which I like very much, obviously. And this is some kind of a circle. So it says that, well, obviously drugs, they alter the way, they change the way how you play music as a musicians, but it also impacts the way you listen to music or the type of music you like to hear to. So when you have a closer look at drugs, you see there's a whole zoo of things that are there. So there's a rough classification: depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. And with depressants, for example, morphium, heroin, but also alcohol, they suppress the nervous system, so brings it down. And for therapy, some of these depressants are used to treat anxiety or insomnia. So drugs are not only taken for recreational use, but also for therapy. Then you have the stimulants. So they make you kind of high. We have you increase the level of neural activity, and dopamine is kind of supported by that. So users seek some high, and but their side effects, of course, for example, anxiety or hallucinations and paranoia. In World War II, meth, for example, was given to soldiers because it has the effect that you don't have the desire anymore to sleep or to eat, which is kind of very practical if you're a soldier. And on third group, but there you see on the picture there are lots of overlays here. You have the hallucinogens like LSD or mescaline or psilocybin, which can cause or which can trigger hallucinations and alterations in perceptual experiences. And this is not a complete picture of all the drugs we have. And I can't go, and I don't want to, and I can't go into detail because I'm not a chemist. But what I found impressive is how many drugs there are, and I think this reflects what Jakob Rieke yesterday called the pleasure of intoxication. I think because there's so many different drugs But we are not the only ones. If you look at dolphins, for example, they like to hunt these globefish. They're highly poisonous. So when they're attacked, they they give out some kind of poison. And on high doses, it kills you, but in low doses, it has other effects. And dolphins, especially young male ones, love it. So they chase these globefish, and they inhale this toxin, which makes them dizzy, and which is like an hallucinogen. And they even pass this fish on like a joint. There is a really great video. This is from this is a screenshot of a BBC video. You can find it on YouTube, just with dolphins and drugs, and you find it. And after a while, you see these dolphins like float around, completely sedated, and they seem to love it. So we talk about like these altered states of consciousness. So a non-altered state of consciousness would be like this. So the perception is like normal. But with drugs, they can be altered. Also with sleep, remember or think of when you dream. So really crazy things happen, bizarre things happen when you dream, as far as you remember. But there are also induced states of consciousness here on this side, and most of them are reversible, only temporary for a couple of time. But there also can be persistent. So remember the lobsters we heard about yesterday. And these altered state of consciousness, they can be induced by drugs, but also by other factors such as hypnosis. We heard about this in the previous talk, or meditation, or sleep deprivation, or sensory deprivation. So when you're in a room which is completely quiet, completely dark for a long time, then there's no input then, but then the brain produces this input for yourself. So you hear voices and you see pictures. So when you come to drugs, the effect of drugs on the perception of music, I'm going to start with cannabis. There are strong anecdotal hints that drugs have an effect. Like Lindsay Buckingham of Fleetwood Mac said, if you've been working on something for a few hours and you smoke a joint, it's like hearing it again for the first time. And George Harrison said, I think that pot definitely did something for the old ears. Like suddenly I could hear more subtle things in the sound. So there are many like anecdotal hints that there is something. And when you look at studies, first this is a collection of some studies, some self-reported cannabis effects, where these were open-ended questions, so the participant could just talk or say whatever they want on the effect of cannabis, and you see that relaxation was the most often mentioned, but there are also other things like appreciation of music is there, or time slowed down, and timing, rhythm also has something to do with music. Another studies with closed answers, so certain phrases were given and the subjects had to say, well, yes, there is something that or not. The most often mentioned thing was time. Time slows down. 96% of all people said time slows down, but you see that 42% said that it's the opposite. Time goes faster. So it's possible that you have the impression that both happens, and we're going to have a look at this in more detail quite soon. So there seems something to be with music and with time. So Tchorz said, the most characteristic effect of marijuana is an auditory one, which is experienced very often, or usually by almost all users, and occurs at a low level of intoxication, especially like the notes of music are purer and more distinct, and the rhythm stands out more. So what about now the cannabis and the perception of time? J.R. Anderson, he's an American poet, he experienced it like the following. He said the first effect was the alteration of time values. Time was so immensely lengthened that it practically ceased to exist. But this slowing down applied only to physical events. For example, my own movements and those of other people. It did not apply to the process of my own thought. Those, on the contrary, appear to be very greatly accelerated. So this sounds puzzling. So is it like, is the subjective clock faster or slower? We'll see in a minute that this is not a contradiction, but that it really fits quite well. So you have to measure the subjective time. How can you do this? The two most important methods or tools to measure the perception of time are estimation and production. Estimation means the experimenter delimits an interval of time. He says 20 seconds, so please push this button for... no, it's the other way. That was production, sorry. Estimation would be a light is switched on for, say, 20 seconds, and the subject has to estimate how many seconds were these, without like quite counting or something, but an estimate. And production would be the experimenter says push this button for 20 seconds, and then we see what happens. And this is a result of a study for cannabis users. So 4 users were taken, and they smoked joints and THC in 2 different concentrations, and the task was a production task. So they were instructed to delimit different time intervals with the foot pedals. So they were said, press this foot pedal for, say, 30 seconds. And you see what happens. So they were told to push the button, for example, for 30 seconds, but in real time, it took only 25 seconds or so when they were intoxicated. When they were sober, it was a bit different. So when they were told to push that button for 30 seconds, it took about, in real time, something like 40 seconds. That means that the internal clock runs faster. So I think, so when I was told 30 seconds, so I count 30, not 30, zack. But in real time, it's not 30 seconds, it's quite shorter. That means your internal clock runs faster. And that explains why things that happen outside seem to be slower, because your internal time is faster than things that happen outside, somebody moving or like music playing, that seems to be slower. But your own thoughts are quite fast compared to the things that happen outside. So this is not a contradiction that fits quite well. And another group of researchers did the same with rats as well, to see, well, what's about with other animals. So they trained rats to estimate time. So these rats were thirsty, and one way to get water was to push a button 30 seconds after a light went on. So the rats learned light goes on, so I have to wait for about 30 seconds, and then I have to push, and then I get the water. And it took them about 5 months to train these rats, and then they got cannabis injected. And you see what happens here is the same as with the persons, without any drugs. So this is the bar on the left, without any drugs. It took on average like 33 seconds until they pushed the button, but with drugs it was a bit faster, like about 30 seconds. So the internal clock of the rats also went faster. And when it comes to music, when this is intervals of say 30, 40 seconds, music is much faster. But the conclusion of one of the researchers is, if you are a musician, you're going to play the thing the way it is printed on a sheet. But if you're using marijuana, you're going to work in about twice as much music in between the first note and the second note. So that's what made jazz musicians. The idea is that they could jazz things up, lift them up. So as if music is heard through some kind of time lens, so that you have better insight to what happens between short intervals of time. Now it comes to psychoacoustics, the effects of cannabis on the perception of frequency and intensity. Well, psychoacoustics is about the relationship between physical properties of sound, like hertz and decibels, on the one side, and on the other side, on the perception. So perception in different basic dimensions. For example, the effect of frequency and decibels on loudness, or on pitch, or on sharpness, or on roughness, things like that. So basic dimension of acoustical perception. Not the complex ones, not pleasure, pleasantness or something. This is way too complicated, and this doesn't have to do only with the physical part. Imagine you have a motorbike, a Harley Davidson, you love it. Then you will also love the sound of your Harley Davidson, definitely. You find it very, very pleasant. Your neighbor, not necessarily. The sound is the same, but two different people will rate it completely different. But even though if you love the sound of your Harley Davidson, you wouldn't love the sound if it was the same if you put your dishwasher on. So you have other expectations concerning the sound of your dishwasher. So that's why these dimensions, like pleasantness or pleasure or joy, whatever, these cannot really be grasped with psychoacoustics. So these are the limits of psychoacoustics, classical psychoacoustics, when it comes to music. And psychoacousticians, they love thresholds because a threshold is something which you can measure very exactly and very easily. For example, you have some sort of noise and also you have a tone. And then you measure the threshold, so how many decibels the tone needs to have that I can hear the sound, the tone, in presence of that noise. And then you can change the bandwidth of the noise, for example, and then you get an impression of what we call spectral masking, and that was referred to by Ingrid in the discussion this morning. So spectral masking, so which tones do I hear and which I cannot hear. So this is what happens in the inner ear of the basilar membrane, and there we have some practical consequences of psychoacoustics. When you think of music compression like MP3, basically you can throw away about 90% of all the physical information which is in the spectrum and the waveform, and it still sounds more or less the same. But when you go to the effect of drugs to these psychoacoustic thresholds, then we see that, for example, drugs, cannabis and other drugs, don't have any effect on the hearing threshold. The hearing threshold is the sound level you need to just hear a tone. It's very important to measure stages of hard of hearing, for example. So if you're hard of hearing, if you have a hearing loss, the bad news is that taking cannabis or any other drug won't help you to improve your threshold of hearing. Also, no effect or an inverse effect on the differential, intensity differential threshold. So when you have a sound and another sound with it, which is like 5 decibels higher, then you hear there's a difference. And there's also a threshold, depends on the sound, whether it's a broadband sound or a pure tone, roughly 1 dB difference you can hear, that there is a difference in loudness. This threshold isn't improved by cannabis, but the other way around, you get worse of that. Also, no effects of cannabis to frequency discrimination. So 2 tones. If I want to distinguish 2 tones, cannabis doesn't help. One study found a slight preference for higher frequencies, but that was a poorly designed study with only few subjects, and so in terms of statistic, not really a strong thing. I would like to skip, because of time reasons, I would like to skip this one here and go to...
Because we started late.
Yeah, okay.
Sound check at 13 o'clock for the concert.
Yeah. So I'm gonna do some time distortions here. So as a first summary with respect to cannabis, we know that users, they report strong auditory effects. We've seen that. But if you do formal experiments in the lab, the effects are a bit smaller. For example, with time perception, yes, there is a measured effect, but this is smaller than felt. Like this is like 20%, or in the rats that was just 10%. But users say, well, time stood still, something like that. So they experience strong effects which you can't find in the lab. There are almost non-effects in terms of like psychoacoustical performance thresholds. You can't find anything there. But there are clear effects in self-reported items. That was something I just skipped with cannabis. People felt that music is a bit more emotional and that touched them a bit more. So to summarize this part on cannabis, maybe we do not have the right tools yet to find, like in the lab, to find what has been expressed verbally. The second part is on hallucinogens, especially LSD. The guy here, you see here, it's Albert Hofmann, and his name is linked with LSD because he was the one who first synthesized LSD. He was working for Sandoz in Basel in the 30s and 40s, and they wanted to find some medication for respiratory diseases, so nothing with hallucination or something. So he synthesized LSD, hoping to having something for these respiratory problems. And by accident, more or less, he absorbed a very small amount of LSD and felt strange effects. And a couple of days later, he made something like a formal experiment in the lab. So he took 250 micrograms in the lab, and then all of a sudden he really felt very bad. And it began as something like a bad trip, and he wanted to go home. He had to cycle home. That's why this day is called the Bicycle Day, and is kind of celebrated each year. So it started as a bad trip. He described on the way home, he had terrible visual distortions and things seemed to move which are not supposed to move. So that was really scary. And his neighbor, he thought his neighbor was an evil witch or something. So not very good. But after a while it went better, and he said, well, little by little I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. So that was Albert Hofmann on April the 19th, 1943. So April 19th is Bicycle Day. This is tomorrow, so be prepared. With LSD, since the late 40s, LSD has been used in medication for psychiatric uses or to simulate psychiatric diseases, but also treating them. In the 60s, LSD began to be used widely spread, which led to worldwide bans since the mid and late 60s, because it was kind of too much. And some countries were feared that this destabilizes things. So then it was almost nothing. A couple of years or many years since then, there were no studies on LSD and almost no research. That changed a bit during recent years, and there was an increased research interest now to use LSD and other hallucinogens as psychotherapy. Also, a trend coming from Silicon Valley is microdosing. That means taking very little doses which don't make you high, but which like increase your creativity or productivity and brighten up the mood for the day. And last year, interestingly, Oregon was the first state in the US legalizing possession of small amounts of LSD. This is a study now on the effects of LSD not connected to music, but in the lab. So that was a couple of years ago. People were invited under very controlled conditions. They were taking either LSD or a placebo, so they didn't know what they get. And you see these filled squares in black. These are the results for different questions on the effect they experience. So the scale is from 0 to 100%. And on the x-axis, you see different aspects. On the left, there are certain aspects of altered state of consciousness. For example, oceanic boundlessness. For example, they experience very much with LSD, but with the placebo, everything is on the zero line. There is nothing. And also other things like visionary reconstructualization or experience of unity, blissful state, and so forth and so forth. So very strong effects of LSD, but only very little effect here. One of these, I try to find the mouse and I can't find it. One of the bars on the lowest is auditory alteration. So there was nothing much with acoustics, but that was a lab experiment. So people stayed there for a couple of hours in the lab, but music was not the topic of that study. So it was quiet, basically. Another study, a recent study, was involved in that response, emotional response to music. So people were exposed to music with and without LSD. And they had to rate their impression with and without LSD. They didn't know whether it's placebo or not. And you see on the left-hand side, there is the placebo. These are the 10 subjects. Placebo is much lower than with LSD. So the emotional effect is higher with LSD. And on the right-hand side, you see different subcategories like wonder or transcendence or power or tenderness. This all is increased under LSD. And finally, I would like to say some words about music-assisted psychedelic therapy. Which is there is certain interest now recently. The idea is that if you take psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin from the magic mushrooms or others, this helps it to let go some psychological control, so that your emotions are kind of freed and released. Some kind of catharsis happens. And in recent studies, there were in clinical studies, there were promising results actually in treating things like anxiety, depression, alcoholism, or smoking addiction using these drugs. And actually in 2019, the FDA, the American Food and Drug Association, calls psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for severe depression. Music always is a vital component, but the choice of that music appears important. So the session normally looks like that the subject, there's a therapist, and the subject gets the dose, and then is instructed to like close your eyes, lay down, and let it flow, kind of for a couple of hours. But the type of music, it's not standardized yet. There was one study was undertaken to ask people who do these kind of therapeutic sessions and ask them, well, which music do you prefer or do you recommend? So there were lots of recommendations for pieces for both the pre-peak experience, so before there's a full happening of the drug taking, and then peak experiments and also post-peak experiments. And then some music theory experts analyze that and try to find properties in the music which seem to be important for pre-peak and peak experience. Also, playlist was introduced. So these are some musical features in terms of composition and phrase structure, which is recommended then for pre-peak and peak music. Here you see a playlist. It's a very long playlist. I stopped, the last entry was a piece of Pink Floyd, that's why I stopped there. But these sessions, they take a couple of hours. I couldn't find this playlist on Spotify, but another one of Mendel Kaelen, who did one of these studies, you can find it on Spotify. Just search for Mendel Kaelen and you find this very long, hours-long playlist. I'd like to conclude with some quotes from subjects who underwent this music-assisted psychedelic therapy. For example, the music was melding with what I was feeling, and I was all mixing up to create images in my mind. The music was the whole script, the whole movie, the whole everything. Or I was in love with the music, but I felt like it was also in love with me. That was great feeling. Or it was gorgeous being carried with the music from dark to light, from tension to total relaxation. Or my entire body was musical instrument for every sound, which was coming through my head, and it eviscerated from top to bottom. I know what a grand piano feels like when it is played. And to let go and become enveloped in the beauty of, in this case, music was enormously spiritual. But there were also, to conclude, that there were also other voices. Some people said, well, music is disturbing. I don't like that music. So then the therapist has to change that, or even as they point out, even had to switch it off, so no music at all. So that would be my conclusion. So silence can be golden from time to time. Okay, thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting insight into the Wirkung of drugs.
The effect.
As I see that we have these rehearsals for the concerts, I would say we also do discussion in our big discussion round, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So have a good lunch break and see you later on for the next session, and also, of course, for the discussion and concert tonight.